Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Welcome to our next video with the Quran. We're still on the first chapter of the Quran, and in today's video, we're going to begin the next verse, which is verse number 5, which begins with إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ, which basically translates to that it is you that we worship and it is with you that we seek help. I'm just going to be briefly touching upon the first part of that verse, so the first half of that verse. So let me just share that with you right now. If you give me a second, we'll do that right now. Okay, so here we go. So you should now be able to see a verse that appears. إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. This is the fifth verse of the chapter of Fatiha, the opening of the Quran. And I'm just going to be looking briefly at the first part. There's two parts to this verse. إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ. You we worship. And then the second part is it is you that we seek help and assistance from. I'm not going to talk about this today, but I'm also going to just touch briefly upon the first part of this verse. And in fact, I'm not even going to go into so much detail about the verse. I'm briefly going to talk about why worship can only be exclusively and specifically for God, for Allah. There are a number of reasons. I'll outline the reasons now before I go into the details so you have them there with you. Number one is the gift of life, right? Number one is the gift of life that God has given us. The second reason is this idea of need, that we need God. We are utterly dependent upon God for all our needs, and I'll talk about that a little bit more detail. The third reason is that the power of God is certain. The fourth reason is this notion of servitude to God. Uh, the fifth reason is that God is the necessary existent, and everything else, like me and you, is contingent, i.e., we need our for our existence other things. God is independent of that. God does not need anybody or anything for his existence. I'll talk about it in a bit more detail. And final one really is the perfect power of God. Right. So I'm going to talk about these in a little bit more detail with you, and I'll be reading the Arabic in parts, just so we can really follow the important discussion that's taking place here as well. So he begins, the scholar begins, the Sheikh begins, Imam Razi, for in our case here, Tafsir Razi, we're looking at his book. He says, Al-Fa'ila, Al-Ibadatu, Ibadah means worship, if you want to use that word. It's an expression of a fi'l, of a verb. It's ibadah is a doing thing. It's something that you do, right? And why do you do it? Because you want to exalt something. So it's a form of exaltation. Ibadah is a verb. So when something is a verb, as you know, grammar, it's a fi'l, it's a doing. And it's a form of exaltation of something. So when you're worshipping something, so if you think about it today, in a very generic sense, in a very general sense, when people exalt something or someone, they are, in a sense, worshipping that, right? They are, in a sense, worshipping that. So whether that's a football team, whether that's a god, whether that's something else, whatever else it may be, another human being, someone of the opposite gender, whatever it may be, whoever it may be, when you exalt that thing or that person, you are in essence doing ibadah of it. You are, in a general sense, you are exalting it. So therefore, you are worshipping it. Right? We have many secular gods today. So this is like the general meaning of what ibadah means, what worship means as well. And he kind of goes into a little bit of linguistic meaning of ibadah. This is very important. He says tariqatun mu'abbadun. It's a path which is mu'abbad. Mu'abbad means well trodden. It's a well trodden path. It's a well trodden way. Ay mudallalun, right? It's a path that's subdued, right? So this is important. So he's just telling you some introductory remarks in terms of what the word ibadah actually means. All right, so we're okay with that. Then he says, when we say iyyaka na'bud in the Quran, when Muslims recite iyyaka na'bud, you we worship, right? What you're basically saying, in other words, la a'budu ahadan siwak. That's like if you were to bring the sentence, if you were to expand the sentence, you would say, I worship no one besides you. I'm worshiping no one besides you. I'm only worshiping you, O God. والذي يدل على هذا الحصر وجوها. So there are ways that you can think about and come to know why this exclusivity. The word hasr means exclusivity, because in Islam, as Muslims, we are only meant to worship God. We are only meant to exalt God and nothing, nobody else. And how do you know this? How do you realize that worship can only be for God? And this is the reasons that I mentioned at the beginning as outline introductions. So let's go through the first one, which is basically this concept of life, that God has given you life. Therefore, if you reflect upon your existence, you will come to know that only God is worthy of worship. So he begins this way. He says, أن العبادة عبارة عن نهاية التعظيم. That ibadah is the uppermost limit, the highest form of exaltation, azim, right? And this can only be for the one who gives you the highest form of gift. And he says the greatest gift that you have been given is life. The greatest gift that me and you have been given is life. Why is that? Why is life such, I mean, why is existence such a great gift, right? He says, because of life, right, uh, you are able to derive benefit, intifa. You are able to derive benefit, and you're also able to create things through which you can get benefit. So life is about benefiting, and God has given you life so you can gain benefit. Of course, in other places, the Quran and the scholars tell us that benefit, something is beneficial when it draws you closer to your Creator, right? So God has given you life so that you can benefit, but you can also create things from which benefit is also derived from as well. And this is the first stage of creation life, right? That when you're created, you're able to take benefit as well. And God mentions in the Quran, وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْتُكَ مِنْ قَبْلُ وَلَمْ تَكُ شَيْئًا. I did indeed create you before when you had been nothing, right? Allah also says in the Quran, كيف تكفرون بالله وكنتم أمواتا فأحياكم. How can you reject faith in God, right? That you were without life. وكنتم أمواتا, you were dead, you had no life, right? And then He gave you life. So this is like the fact that God has given you life is one of the greatest gifts that you can acquire. And then He says at the second level that He has created things through which you can benefit. Like you can create things through which you can benefit as well, right? So Allah says in the Quran, for example, هو الذي خلق لكم ما في الأرض جميعا. That is He, God, who has created for you all things that are on this earth, right? And this is in the Quran as well. So this is something to bear in mind. One bear in mind. ولما كانت المصالح الحاصلة في هذا العالم السفلي إنما تنتظم بالحركات الفلكية على سبيل الإجراء العادل، لا جرم أتبعه بقوله ثم استوى إلى السماء فسواهن سبع سماوات وهو بكل شيء عليم. So he says that um, after saying that God has created these things for you to benefit from, then he says that in terms of our human interests, right, in this world, it requires that the cosmos, the earth, the moon, the stars, and everything else, all these heavenly creations that God has created, have to move in a certain way. I.e., we need the sun, right? We need the sun to rise, we need the sun to set, we need the earth to move in a certain way. All of these things that are moving by God's decree, right? And He's created all these things for your service. It can only be from the perfection of God, right? That God has perfect knowledge of all of these things, right? And so without, I mean, for example, if the sun decided, or if God decided that the sun should not rise tomorrow, and we were to be left in darkness, we would die, right? Or if it was the other way around, if the sun didn't set anymore, or whatever else would happen in the cosmos, we would cease to exist. So the fact that God controls all of this, and through God's creation that we are benefiting from it, is also very, very important as well. So he's showing us, he's showing us, right? فَثَبَتَ بِمَا ذَكَرْنَا, that is affirmed that every gift that you have, that you acquire, is from God, right? And so as a result, it follows logically, right? It follows logically that worship should only be through him, for him. Right? So this is what iyyaka na'budu means, that you we worship, right? So this word of this gives us this idea that it's limited only to Allah. Only God can be worthy of worship. That's fine. We agree on that. Let's look at a second reason. He says another thing to reflect upon is that our need. And if you think about our needs, it's very, very important, because Allah has used 5 names for Himself in this chapter, right? It's very, very important. And He relates these 5 names, these 5 attributes of God, to time. He says God has 5 names in this surah, in this chapter. Allah, His name of His essence, Rabb, Rahman, Rahim, and Malik Yawmiddin. And then He says, human beings have 3 states: past, present, and future. And look how he will take these 5 names of God here in this chapter and take the 3 tenses, past, present, and future, and connect them to show how we are always in need of God, whether it's our past, whether it's our present, and whether it is our future. So let's see how he takes us through that journey. He says, look, the first one, as regards to the past, you didn't even exist. You were non existent, right? As God says in the Quran, وَقَدْ خَلَقْتُكَ مِنْ قَبْلُ وَلَمْ تَكُ شَيْئًا, that I did indeed create you before when you had been nothing, right? You had basically been dead, lifeless, and Allah gave you life. So Allah says in the Quran again, كيف تكفرون بالله وكنتم أمواتا فأحياكم, that how is it that you reject faith in God, seeing that you are without life and He gave you life, right? And He says, look, you were even ignorant, and God gave you knowledge. Allah says in the Quran, والله أخرجكم من بطون أمهاتكم لا تعلمون شيئا وجعل لكم السمع والأبصار والأفئدة. And God says in the Quran that He brought you forth from the wombs of your mothers when you knew nothing, right? And He gave you hearing, He gave you sight, and He gave you intelligence, right? So He not only did He bring you into existence, but He also gave you these faculties, these senses, the intellect as well, right? So you went from a state of non-existence to existence, from death to life, from impotence to ability, from ignorance to knowledge, because God created me and you, and He took us from one state to another, right? And so this refers to our past, because God did this for us in the past, but this is also showing His first name. Remember, we're connecting the past, present, and future with His 5 names, and say this also shows you that He must be God. He must be your Lord. All right. And so this is something to bear in mind as well. All right. Now let's move on to the second one, which is to do with the present. Okay. And he says here, where's it gone? Let's find it. وَأَمَّا الْحَالِ. Hal means the present, right? When you, in the present time, you were in need. You were in dire need, right? Because when you were not existent, you weren't in need. But the fact that you've come into existence now, um, the doors of neediness has opened, and you have various necessities, right? So it's like God is saying, I'm your Lord, because I am Allah, because I have taken you out from non-existence to existence. And when you became existent, you had many needs. فَأَنَا رَبٌّ رَحْمَنٌ رَحِيمٌ. So therefore, I am your Lord. Um, I am the one who does your tarbiyah, who takes care of you. I am the one that shows mercy towards you. Right. So you can see the second two names here, Rahman and Rahim, or even the third and second, third and fourth name. This notion of Rabb, Rahman and Rahim are in play. That He has taken care of you when you're in your greatest need. That you've come into existence. When you were non-existent, you didn't have any needs, but the fact that you've come into existence, now you need God. So I am your Rabb, I am your Lord, I am the one who is merciful towards you as well. So this is something to bear in mind. And then he says, okay, this is to connect it with the past, sorry, to do with the present. Let's look at your future, right? وأما المستقبل, right? فهي حال ما بعد الموت والصفة المتعلقة بتلك الحالة. So this is when this is to do with your third state, which is to do with the future and to do with what is going to happen once you die. And he says that you will need God once you die, right? And this is to do with Malik Yawmiddin, that God is the Malik, the sovereign of the day of judgment. So these five attributes of God, these names of God, Allah, Rabb, Rahman, Rahim, Malik Yawmiddin, are all connected to your needs, both in the past, present, and in the future as well. Okay, so this proves that only God is worthy of worship. This is the second reason, if you like. What's the third reason? This is a little bit more involved, but basically, all he is saying is that we know that God is powerful. We know that God is knowledgeable. We know He's kind. We know He's generous. And we know this like through just decisive proofs. It's so obvious that this is what God must be, right? As for everybody else, there's always doubt. No one's gonna have the same, nowhere near the level that God has, right? Um, and so God, because of this, and everything has doubt, it makes sense that only God would be exclusively worthy of worship and nobody else, because everybody else is deficient. And even if people do have knowledge, even if people are kind, even if people are generous, forbearing, etc., 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 all of these good things that we want to see in people, it's always going to be in some way deficient. But God is perfect in all of these things. So therefore it makes sense that you would seek that which is perfect as opposed to something that is deficient, right? So that's very, very important to bear in mind as well. Then the fourth one he mentions as well, that being a slave is a humble state, it's a lowly state, right? And the highest state is obviously of being the master, right? um, and so because God is the most noble, God is the loftiest of everything that ever exists, right? um, Therefore, because he is at the highest level in terms of servitude, God would be the highest level of servitude that we should have, which makes sense, right? And God's power, God's knowledge, all of these things surpasses anything that's ever in existence. So therefore, when it comes to ubudiyya, when it comes to servitude, it should ultimately be for the sake of God. This is very rational. This is the next one he says. The next one is very, very interesting as well. He says, look, everything that exists is contingent. What does that mean? Basically, me and you wouldn't exist if there wasn't God. Me and you wouldn't exist if God hadn't created our mothers and fathers. And you can see the argument. But God is wajib li dhatihi. God doesn't need, as he says elsewhere in the Quran, he doesn't need a mother or a father. God doesn't need anything. He's completely independent from his creation, right? So you can see where this argument is going. So it would make sense that that which is necessarily existent, i.e., God, wajib li dhatihi, would be far superior to anything that's contingent, anything that needs something else, somebody else, other things for its existence. So therefore, God is only worthy of worship. Our worship should only be for the sake of God. You can see a lot of these are rational ideas that if you think about it, it makes sense. The next one is to look at the perfect power of God. It's quite long, but in essence, what he's saying is that um, he has the power over everything. He can hold the sky up without any sort of frame or pillars, and the earth without any support. He causes the moon and the sun to move and to run their course. He the South Pole and the North Pole, all of these things. You can go on for like ad infinitum. God has power over everything, right? And so if God has power over everything, we have like very limited power. We barely have any power, right? Even when we do have power, it's unpredictable. It can be dangerous. We don't really know how to use it properly. But it is only God who has complete power over everything. And so, therefore, it would make sense that because of his perfect power, God would only be worthy of worship. I'm going to stop there. And I want to thank everyone for listening. I hope you found that useful. And until next week, take care. Good evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.